Okay, Don McNeil from Edge Connects. First up. Okay, I'm going to sit here, so you can be brave and sit there. Jack Waters from Zayo. Hey, Jack, welcome. Oh, thank you.
Here are your notes.
The man who brought the notes. Hey, you get to answer the first question. Awesome. Hey, Chris Rice from AT&T. Tim Naramore from Masergy. Have a seat, gentlemen. I'm gonna pitch my chair this way so I can look at you. Okay. All right. Well, you heard what John had to say. Chris, I'm sure nothing he said surprised you particularly, but
fantastic.
But no, I thought it had a lot to say about how the industry is changing. What we're going to be talking about is also about change. We're going to be talking about change in relationships, because this has always been traditionally an industry built on some kind of, I guess we used to call it coopetition. You cooperated, but you also competed. And so the theory of this panel is that relationships within the industry are changing as part of this broader transformation process. So I'm going to start, and I'll make Jack go first because he brought me my notes. I'm going to ask each of you, is this true, and can you share ways in which you see this happening within your company? Are relationships changing in general? And if you don't think they are, say that. But if you think they are, share an example, if you could, from the Zayo perspective.
Well, I think, and good morning. I think the way I toyed on this question, for the last day or so, and I'm historically an internet guy, and I kind of look at the way the internet grew up with a lot of cooperation, whether it was technology, protocol definition, hardware, interconnection, peering, all those things that happened over the years, and there's a lot of cooperation, coopetition. I think it's changing because what's happening in our industry, the disruption that John talked about, what's happening is that fundamentally enterprises, consumers are getting more comfortable with public networks.
Okay.
And when you think about it, you think about, well, look, we all talk about the web scale guys. Hans Jurgen's going to talk later. But really what that is kind of a fundamental shift of consumers and businesses getting more comfortable with public infrastructure. And public infrastructure isn't always the public internet. It's a shared piece of infrastructure, whether it's from dark fiber all the way up to internet technology. And I think that is what is forcing the industry to change in how it cooperates. And whether you're in the data center business or in the overlay and SD-WAN business, or AT&T, it's forcing you to change how you think about your fundamental offers, the way you interact with your competitors, and the way you interact with customers.
Interesting. Chris, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certain parts of that I definitely would agree with. I want to, and John mentioned the kind of professional shopper, thing there in terms of like the way we used to do things. I think that's a big fundamental shift. In other words, if I take a look at now the way we look at buying things, it's much different than kind of the old, let's put a set of specifications together, let's get something back that closely represents what we asked for, and kind of do some long drawn out testing associated with it and put a stamp of approval on it. If you think about it now, what we do is we work much more tightly with the people who are actually building the chipsets themselves, understanding what their roadmap is, what kind of capabilities will be there, and as that's pushed into the industry, through the different ecosystem, we're pulling that back out, and we know what capabilities are in it because we actually worked with them as part of the roadmap. We'd mentioned in the speaker before, John from Cisco mentioned white boxes.
Yvette, right.
Right, Yvette, right. We're obviously all looking at white boxes, but there's a whole ecosystem that's built up around that, which I think we can talk a little bit more about later, but I think that area of white boxes, and then an OS on top of that. And so those are like, fundamental facts that are kind of changing it. And then you say, well, how do you as a company, work into that new ecosystem, right?
Okay.
And we said, well, look, it's really important for us to software define what we're doing. It's really important for us to build a network cloud because there wasn't really a network cloud before. There were public IT clouds, but not a network cloud.
Right.
It's really important for us to build an automation capability and software and put that in open source. And then, quite frankly, help define what the vendor should be doing in terms of getting it more common for us, right? And then having a certification environment. So those big four areas were really fundamental in the way that we not only shifted internally, as John had mentioned, but also recognized what was happening and how we adapted to it.
Okay. So Jack represented the Zayo point of view, and you guys are doing, obviously, massive fiber networks. everybody knows AT&T. Tim, Masergy is a managed service provider. How are your relationships changing, or are they?
I would say that to some degree they're not changing because our business model has always been built on top of partnering with other people.
Okay.
So we run and own the electronics in our backbone network, but the last mile we acquire from over 130 partners including the folks on this panel.
Thank you.
On an as needed basis.
Were you writing checks backstage?
Yeah, it was. It is, that was always part of our model, and we spend a lot of time, one of our core values is that we treat our partners and our employees and our customers all very transparently.
Okay.
And so we have kind of already had a partnership model.
Okay.
What I would say is changing is specifically in the technology, in that where we find a shared vision, we're helping to develop products and bring them to market.
Okay.
A great example of that is, we brought our premise-based NFV solution to market over 2 years ago. We could not have done that if we hadn't been able to partner directly with Overture, which is now ADVA,
Right.
and Prayson Pate and his team. But we shared a vision as to what we wanted to accomplish, and we were able to pull together, what was at the time the first
But you
CPE.
worked in a different way with Overture at the time, now AVA. You worked differently with them than you would have in the past with vendors? With the
No,
vendor?
I wouldn't say so. I would say that what we're seeing is more of an openness
Okay.
versus we'll put it on the list and we'll get
give
to
you the
your
features we want
yeah.
and take them off.
Well, at the annual user meeting, everybody will vote.
Right.
I think it's much more about the value that we all see from. I always like to say it's not about having one throat to choke. It's about how many people are at the table celebrating and toasting each other when you win.
Okay, fair enough. So Don, you came out of service XO experience, but you're at Edge Connect
Yeah, it was
doing
too
something very
hard.
different. Pardon?
It was too hard.
It's too hard. But at Edge Connect, you're doing something very different in terms of the way you are creating an edge-based data, or edge data center. How is that company's relationships different?
Yeah, well, I just, if you step back and look at it, the biggest relationship change that I've seen, and really one of the reasons that it's interesting to be on the infrastructure side is the largest customers, the web scale customers, of the last decade are now, as we know, significantly investing in infrastructure. It quietly began with 1 or 2 submarine cables. Now there isn't probably a submarine cable that's not on the drawing board, for example, that's not being, driven by the web scale companies.
Right.
And then certainly data centers. And so for us, it's one of those where, it's pretty clear that whether this infrastructure is, viewed as strategic, necessary, or, I love John's comment that, someone's looking at your profit as their revenue stream. It all becomes an interesting dynamic there from that relationship. But for us, because we're new and we've been at it for 3 years, and the idea of an edge data center being kind of we position this as an open, neutral data center that can be positioned and put where customers need them. So we can take advantage of the fact that if these large cloud data centers, for example, are going in places like Des Moines, Iowa, or in the North Carolina, or wherever they are starting to pop up because of all the dynamics that go there with regard to the economics of power and
right.
land, et cetera, then we're able to, I think, plug in and take advantage of this new shift, right? How many more data centers can you build in Ashburn? Don't get me wrong, they continue to build them there, but it really becomes the point of, just fundamentally, when is enough enough?
Okay.
So certainly changing, and we like to think we're pretty well positioned to participate.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to start, Chris, I'm going to start with you on this one. Who benefits from all this change, and who's challenged by it?
Yeah, I think who benefits is, no crystal ball, so that'll take a little time to tell. But I think there is a fundamental shift that's occurring with the separation of the hardware and software. That's very easy to say, but I think that's a very fundamental shift. Quite frankly, no less, I should say, fundamental than the shift that occurred like 30, 40 years ago in the PC industry.
Okay.
And if you think about what happened there were these vertically integrated companies that were building computers.
Right.
It was all in-house, all the way from hardware to software.
Right.
Famously, they made the money on the hardware because the software was all special, and then it shifted. Right, it fundamentally shifted so that there was someone who said, "We'll take on the responsibility for the network architecture, or for the computer architecture, and then we'll build software on top of that, and a whole ecosystem just proliferated as a result of that, both outwardly in terms of sales, but also ecosystems in terms of supplying to it. And so then you take a look at that as just kind of an analogy, and you say to yourself, well, this same kind of fundamental shift is happening now, this fundamental separation of hardware and software to create software-defined networks. And so what's that likely to do? Well, it's likely to make some pretty big changes in the ecosystem, just like it did in the computer industry. And then there's a question of, well, okay, if that's the fact, then what's the choice, right? Your choice is, do you embrace that? How do you embrace that? And Yvette even talked a little bit about that. Or do you kind of stay on the path that you're on, in which case history tells us that's maybe not the best thing to do. I mean, we've been through, as AT&T, a number of these fundamental shifts. So if I go back, analog to digital, right? Circuit to packet, wireline to wireless.
You left out the step switches, Chris, come on.
Left out the what?
Step switches. Anyway.
Yeah, but there's some really fundamental shifts that we went through, and we embrace those,
Right.
and we're much better as a company, and where we are as a company as a result of that. And I think some of the folks in that ecosystem, under that old model, like where John said, it either got better or it got worse. It didn't stay the same. It's
Right.
kind of bifurcated. I think that's the question that people have to ask themselves.
Okay. So let me put this for each of you in a little bit different way, if you could. I think we've heard a lot. You heard some of it yesterday reflected in Steve Saunders' presentation. There's a feeling that the vendor community in particular is being challenged because what they sold you was hardware. And now you're asking, the hardware needs to be, off the shelf, low cost hardware, but they can't really turn around and sell you. I hear from service providers, we don't want them now to just package their software and charge us the same as if they were selling us hardware. But I'm also hearing from vendors, how do they want this stuff packaged? And nobody really knows for sure, necessarily. Are you guys finding that's the case in your discussions with vendors, that there's some fundamental challenges as to how things are going to be sold and priced, and that business models in general are challenged?
I'd say yes. But the hardware and software industry for a long, long time kind of ignored some of the fundamental economics that were happening. Our industry, I love our industry, but I like to say I'm not in telecom. Our industry kind of violated fundamental rules for decades around economics. We didn't focus on where the volumes were. We had to invent a different protocol. We had to invent a different interface. In the mid-2000s, it was very clear that the Ethernet, as an example, had more volumes by orders of magnitude than any telecom interface. And the switch to Ethernet was fought for years and years and years and years. And then the economics, you could go build a network for 1/10 the cost of a classic network if you just were able to jump to that piece of technology. I think the hardware and software vendors are in that same kind of conundrum right now, having to, all right, how do I navigate this now? And my advice is follow the volumes. If I was running a hardware or software company, I would follow the volumes. Where are, as a ecosystem, where are the volumes? And that's why everybody talks about the web scale guys.
Right.
The web scale guys are just a proxy for where's all the investment, where's all the volume.
Okay. Tim, you're nodding your head. You agree with that?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that one of the most challenging aspects on the NFV front has been the business models, honestly, because if you think about it, there's a whole value chain from people that build the components to people who resell the equipment and the VAR community that is all set up around shipping a cardboard box, okay? And when you move to a license, when we did our first project, there were many cases where vendors were coming to us and saying, we want more for the NFV than we do for the physical box. And we kind of not really sure how you're going to do that. But, you said, is that a challenge? Yes, it is. But then again, everyone faces challenges. It doesn't mean that we can't go across that bridge.
Okay.
I think we have to. I think that the key becomes, for standards organizations are not on necessarily defining the functions, but potentially one area that I could see being a big advantage is in coming up with licensing or, kind of a BSA type approach where you can verify licensing over having every single NFV phone home to the mothership.
Right.
And honestly, I see that as one of the biggest risks in the software-defined stack is what if it can't verify the key? Because vendor X's server's down.
Okay. Oh, for just the licensing key.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I will say, I can't afford to talk software licensing because we only have half hour left, 35 minutes left. But that's one of the things that does keep coming up. And I'll give Chris a chance to talk about his snowflakes in a minute. But before that, Don, I wanted to ask you on this question too. When Jack started off talking, at first I thought you were going to say, the problem we made is for years people actually invested more in developing software, but they didn't value the software. Everything was valued as hardware. So I thought that was where you were going, but I liked where you went, though. That was a very interesting way of looking at it. From your perspective, because you guys are not buying the exact same things they're buying, is it easier because in the data center world because it's always been defined in a certain way, or do you still face the same challenges?
Oh, well, I mean, I think you still face the same challenges. I think really what's come upon the data center space now is this the criticality now of what's running in them and looking for deeper information.
Okay.
So, for example, data center information management. It was one of those where you pick the top 3 or 4 critical components, but now that the market's looking for something more demanding, right?
Okay.
So, but I think the fact that it is in software and there's an open element to it now, I think it does move along pretty quickly. But what I think is interesting is this whole debate now with virtual network function virtualization, which we watch closely. So Tim mentioned ADVA, but their announcement today with Verizon was an interesting one from the standpoint of white box on the premise, right? Because that was always the big, I think, initial debate: do we put a white box on the premise or do we put it in the network? Selfishly for us, being in the data center business, and we kind of fashion ourselves to be the next generation of the good old-fashioned copper LSO that you don't need anymore, is to have an open neutral location that you can call back to, right? And so as that debate's now starting to kind of take shape, where you are going to have some function on the premise, it's not going to go away completely, but then some function in the network. I think that's a big first step, because I thought for a long time that was an interesting debate. Well,
it's similar to what, and I know, Chris, you're on the AT&T lab side, but AT&T's doing with FlexWare also is doing, you have some things on the premises, but it can also all be in the cloud if it needs to be, and that's the same with Masergy, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it depends on the requirements for the customer and delivering the applications, because all this stuff exists for them to run applications on.
Right.
Yeah, I think it depends on the customer and also the VNF itself too. I mean, on the customer side, we have a set of customers, typically maybe on the small, medium business side, who don't necessarily have IT staff and their remote offices and other things, and they want to do everything in the cloud. And obviously, putting things in the cloud makes a lot of sense for them because they're used to like a software as a service model and some other things. So you want to make sure that you can serve those folks. But then there are another set of folks who have that IT staff, who already have equipment there, and so maybe it's lower cost for them to actually put a box there and to be able to do that. And so you want to make sure that both of those can be delivered. And some of the VNFs, maybe not everybody wants. You want to put the core set of VNFs in the box if you're going to have a box, because that's a limited compute, it's a limited footprint.
Right.
And some of the ones that are more what I'll call long tail VNFs, you'll probably put those upstream. So VNF and customer dependent.
Okay.
You asked the question. I don't want to.
No, go ahead.
Who wins?
Okay.
I think that's a really important thing to talk about.
Okay.
I think infrastructure wins. Right now, as you kind of look at and yes, I work for an infrastructure company. You all will tell my boss I said
Jack
that, right?
wins again.
Yeah. No, I really do fundamentally believe that it's so hard to tell what else wins, but it's really clear that infrastructure, whether it's data center or fiber or submarine cables or the basis that probably isn't going to change anytime soon, or wireless, that part of the infrastructure, I think, wins. It's going to need to continue to grow as wireless folks continue to densify their 5G networks. It's going to continue to grow because enterprises are saying, you know what, I don't want to run my data center anymore. I want to be in someone else's. That's not a core competency that I want. And everything that's happening right now, whether you're in the web scale business or you're in the data center business or you're in the fiber business, is kind of pointing towards your your infrastructure right now.
Well, it's interesting you say that because you can look at that either way. On the one hand, infrastructure wins, but and this relates to what John was saying earlier, it only wins if you can figure out how to do it and make a profit. I mean, if it just becomes, and I apologize for using these words, the dumb pipe, if it just becomes, and you're commoditized, and you don't really win on infrastructure, do you?
Well, I mean, look, our company is a small company compared to some here.
You get bigger every day, though.
Yeah, we're getting bigger every day. But the our EBITDA margins are north of 50%. So we like our business a lot. We
Good point.
like the infrastructure business. We're able to operate at a scale that others have not been. We haven't wandered up the stack that is so tempting at times, and we like our business a lot, and I think it is a model that can be hugely profitable.
Okay, good
Yeah,
point.
well, and I think that there has to be a bifurcation because there is so much infrastructure that does need to be built. I mean, as much as it is going on, but then you just need a different investor, right? I mean, think about utilities, right? I mean, we talk about utility computing and the grid thereof, but there are investors that will take a long view, will take a different return profile as compared to a service provider.
Okay.
So do you end up, I mean, honestly, I think Windstream and kind of carving out and setting up CSNL as a REIT
Right.
creates an interesting kind
Yeah,
of first step, right? Because
But nobody's
can't-
followed them. Nobody else has done that.
No, because I think it's fear of the unknown. But at some point, I believe there are going to be more companies that will invest in new fiber routes that need to be built. Because as much as that infrastructure is going into new locations that weren't the common points, they will be connected. And to the point earlier, I believe Ashburn starts to lose its significance, for example.
Okay, so I promised Chris a chance to talk about a snowflake, so I want to get back to that. We've talked, he and I have had a lot of conversations around this lately because of the time we spent together talking about ONAP and the open sourcing of e-com. But this came up, I've asked everybody this question, I want to ask you guys. Can this industry agree on what needs to be common and to keep that infrastructure profitable? And Jack, this may be for people up the stack, but I still want your opinion on it. Can this industry agree on what elements need to be common and how they're going to agree on those? And what form that's going to take? Is that going to be an open source group? Is that going to be, do you carve it up among different groups like the MEF or TM Forum? I'm just interested in what and Chris, I'm going to start with you on this. Can we reach some agreement?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can. We've done this in standards. We've done this in other areas. And, going back to the point about Ethernet, I mean, one of the things there that you have is that was set up really to be kind of an enterprise play. It didn't have all the OAM and, management and everything else it needed. And so that had to mature. So it was really kind of more of a disruptive innovation kind of thing. That Clayton Christensen, it was doing really great here, but had to work its way up the stack. And I think some things hit that. And so what you're trying to do, at least now the way I see it, is that we're trying to get it to the point where a lot of those capabilities that the web scale folks have been done, we can leverage and use. But if you look at why they did this, why did they go do all that? I mean, really kind of back to first principles. I think if you trace it all the way back, I mean, everyone talks about automation, Yvette, everybody was talking about automation, but you trace that back, it really comes down to open interfaces. And why is it open interfaces? Because you have to have open interfaces to get data.
Okay.
Data leads to analytics, analytics lead to insights. Insights allow you to automate certain capabilities and drive them into machine learners, which allow you to further automate or hyper automate them. And so that's where you want to get to, but you got to trace that all the way back as to why. Because a lot of those boxes that they used to buy didn't have those kind of open interfaces. They couldn't kind of get the data they needed. It didn't allow them to do the automation that they needed.
Okay.
And so
that's a very neat tie between how because automation is such a key part of this.
It's a fundamental part that you have to have, because if you don't have that, you can't, right?
Okay.
You don't plant the seed, the tree never grows, right?
Okay.
So you can't make that happen. And at least, from our point of view, is we look at it when we're working to get to this automation, some of the other things we're doing, we want to make sure that we provide the right framework to the vendors who are supplying us. And we kind of asked before, who wins? Mm-hmm. I mean, if I was looking for characteristics of a winner, it would be folks who really view their skills in the software area and can deliver software, understand analytics really well, and can truly cloudify their product, not take it port it, deliver it, but truly cloudify it, scale up, scale down, modify, start, stop, restart, all those kind of things that you have to do if you're going to build a cloud application.
Okay.
And I think if you can get to those kind of points and then put a framework in place that allows vendors to understand what you're expecting, it helps a lot. And I'll get to your snowflake here, but one of the things that I always bring up is that if I had 10 different vendors here of a particular VNF and I wanted to be able to update the firmware, the very first command I issue to it is suspend, to say suspend, don't take any input anywhere else, I'm going to update your firmware. That suspend command is different from 10 different vendors. I bet it's different from 100 different vendors, just because there's no reason for it to be different. That doesn't affect my buying decision at all,
Right.
the fact that they use that for their suspend command. And there's a set of commands like that that apply to every VNF that, quite frankly, if they were common, if they were set as requirements, they would lower the barrier for both us and them, because they'd be able to only build one SKU. I'd only have to adapt to one SKU. And that's that kind of snowflake right now. They all look like snowflakes. We need them to look like Lego blocks.
And that I know you specifically expect to happen in ONAP, correct?
That is one of the things we will be driving as part of ONAP. That's
Okay.
correct.
And in your side job, you're executive director of ONAP, correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
chair of the board.
Chair of the board, I'm sorry. Okay. What about, where would you see all these other things happening, all the other agreements happening? I mean, I keep asking the where because I'm trying to get people to tell me, what do I focus on? Where do I look for this information to see if the industry is actually moving forward?
Let me just, I don't want to take too much time, but I want to jump in because I think John made a point about standards. And I think it's really one more about, like, it's not like, and I think you'd agree that it's not like there's no place for standards, but there's a different timeline and a different expectation associated with standards than there is open source. And standards, when it's all said and done, is really about a bunch of people getting together and compromising. And they're compromising for the best alternative for the overall industry. But in those compromises, there's options. And so if you look at things like even 802.11, when they first built,
Right.
none of them interoperated. And what took to make them all work, it was Wi-Fi Alliance, where they said, hey, here's one profile, these are all work together, and that was more important than the extra dB you got out of this profile or this profile or this profile. And I think that's kind of that focused, I'll call it focused innovation. That's really what's required. And it's part standards, but that's on a different timeline. But code is immutable. It means that you can run it, I can run it, you can put it in an environment, and we'll all get the same answer, right, thankfully. And I think that's an important characteristic to keep in mind as
Okay.
we move forward.
And code is obviously what drives the open source projects.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's why I think that's their place.
Okay, so Tim, where do you think all this is going to happen?
I think that, standards have their place, especially when you're talking about interop between companies
Right.
and networks. Between vendors, we just code around it. We just, honestly, I could care less if there's 10 different APIs for something to do the same thing, because I'm going to map it in my mapping layer in my models, and then it's just writing an interface to that one to do the conversion. So we kind of look at it differently.
But do you get, to Chris's point earlier, do you get all the data you need out of those things if you're dealing with having to create your own sort of layer of abstraction around their APIs?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
We don't pick vendors that don't have APIs that do what we want.
Duh, okay.
And so,
Okay.
Again, I don't know that there's a need to have 20 different NFVs for a router from 20 different companies using 20 different APIs.
Okay.
At least from our standpoint,
How many do you need?
a handful.
Okay.
Because, let's talk about routing is, generally speaking, if you're in a managed service environment, it's either you care about it, what brand it is, or you don't. And that pretty much comes to, is it Cisco or is
Okay.
it anything else?
Okay.
Now,
And
firewalls, people are really religious about, okay? So you're going to have more firewalls, but I don't think you have to have 100 different firewalls.
I
That-
think
but I
this
think-
is a really good point. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think the market decides.
Yeah.
The market pushes you to, standards are incredibly useful, don't get me wrong, but the market eventually whittles down and iterates towards that handful that you're talking about. So it's not, I don't think it's always an ever-expanding thing. I think the market eventually pushes us to a few common solutions, whether it's technology, protocol, or even vendor.
Yeah.
And, look at Arista. Arista started, could you imagine starting a router company in the mid-2000s? And what they did was pretty amazing. They went and looked at the market and they said, you know what, this Broadcom stuff, that's the market. I'm going to build my whole company on this technology, and I mean, they did a great job.
Okay.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, standards, I mean, where they always used to kind of manifest themselves was we would always wait then for standards to end up in the silicon.
Right.
And really, I think it's less about standards, it's more about, I think what Tim was saying, interoperability. And I think two things, right? You wait for new silicon, and then, you know, to embody it. But then I can tell you, I used to buy Cisco routers, as you know, Jack did, and used to buy a wavelength box from an Infinera. It was still my problem then to go fix it, right? So despite standards back then,
Okay.
it didn't really ever work, right? And then sometimes you get from the other vendor, well, you should have bought my other thing, right?
Right,
And
right.
So
Okay.
it's about interoperability. And then I think the other thing is, why are these hyperscale guys doing it? If you ask some of them, their router does 7 things. That's all it does. You know, I think Tim was going there.
The de-abstraction of the functions and the and of course, obviously, the time to market.
Right.
I mean, you know, we were here a couple of years ago and Facebook was talking about their switch.
Right.
Okay, fast forward, go back another 5 years and ask if any of us would have said Facebook was going to develop its own switch.
Right.
Okay, the reason is we're not moving fast enough as an industry, so they're just going around us. And it's all about code.
Well, and the carriers, frankly, are responsible for some of this mess, right? We each had to have our carrier definition of carrier class. We pushed it to the vendor community to build that particular thing, and you close your eyes and open them 5 years later and look at what you got, and frankly, you just need that router that has the 7 functions. You don't need the millions and millions of lines of code in iOS, because you only use a very small portion of it.
And we saw this when back in the early 2000s when we went to a voice over IP. It's like you didn't need to develop a voice over IP system that carried forth every feature from the PBX or Centrex days, because 2/3 of those features never got used. And so you really just needed a voice over IP system that had the stuff people actually used. But the industry wasn't really thinking along those lines. They said, no, if you don't have everything, then we can't really do this. And yeah, it's similar kind of thinking. Okay, so let me get a little bit back on track here. But that interesting discussion. Interesting. So I want to talk about. We talked a little bit about this already, but I want to drill a little bit more deeply into sort of supplier-vendor relationships. And Chris, you talked a little bit about this, and Tim, you did too when you're talking about working with. I'm going to say ADVA going forward, just so we don't confuse people with the ADVA guys. But are you finding that your vendor relationships are significantly different in the way you work with companies? And is it changing who you work with? Are you working with new players? Are you working with the same vendors, but trying to get them to do things differently? Who wants to jump in on that one?
I think we're probably working with many of the same players that we have for many years, but there's a new kind of part of the ecosystem that is becoming really interesting, and that's some of the Celesticas of the world that are wrapping up some of the white box and creating something that you can actually buy direct. And so that's a pretty interesting outcome of some of the Facebook work, some of the other work that some of the other folks have done, where we spend more time talking to that part of the supply chain, to the chip vendors, as somebody mentioned before, than we ever have. And because we want to understand their roadmap, as well as have input into their roadmap.
So Chris, you'd mentioned that as well, talking at the chip level.
Yeah. No, I definitely think it's changing. I mean, again, it goes back to this fundamental disaggregation of the hardware and software, and you even said, some vendors have been talking to you about, well, we used to ship this box, now we ship the software, or how do we ship it? You were saying they want more money for it, or, how do they handle it? And so it has shifted. I think some, and this goes back to a comment John had even made, right? Some have adapted well and, have adapted to that new ecosystem, and then some have not. But, it's really, again, if you look at that fundamental disaggregation, I mean, it's like working with the silicon folks. Then on top of that, you say, well, look, now I want to understand how I do the hardware abstraction for those so I can use multiple different silicons down there. And there's, different DPDK, P4, other kind of things that help you do that. And then you talk about Celestica and others, which is really more about like ODMs and OCP, kind of profiles and how does that happen. And then there are people who are even building like, kind of equipment OSs on top of that. And so it's a whole new stack, kind of like 2 different layers of hardware and software that you say, well, how do I now interact with that stack? Do I have somebody do that for me? Do I take it on? Do I have the technical capability to do that? That's what some of the web scale folks have done. I get those open interfaces, I can define, I can get my data. And so I think it definitely gives us a new ecosystem to work into and a bunch of different, like I'll call them ownership options for how we decide to play in that new ecosystem.
So with all these new options, is it confusing to sort out? Does it take more time?
You know, anything that goes through a disruption is never easy. No one ever goes through a disruption and says, boy, that was great. That was painless, right? And I think that, you know, there are going to be different people who feel different parts of this at different times. I mean, you know, John talked about a really fundamental shift, you know, we've gone through and are going through in terms of the skills pivots and some other things. We were fortunate. We had a lot of really great people, you know, who were able to do that. But, you know, there's going to be some other folks that go through this, and there's, like you said, there's going to be winners and losers associated with it. But I go back to the folks that can cloudify their solutions really well, the folks that know the software really well, and who can help with the analytics associated with it, because that leads to automation. And, you know, that is right. That in the end, that's what gets us back on that curve, that cost curve that John talked about. But there's some fundamental things that have to be in place for that to happen.
Okay. All right, Tim, what do you think in terms of the changing vendor relationships and what are you buying anything from new people?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you see new technologies come out, SD-WAN's a good example.
Okay.
It has introduced new partners for us.
All companies starting with a V, I think.
Yes.
Some here.
Yeah.
But yeah, we've been, you know, kind of the same relationship. I mean, we went through an extensive evaluation of different solutions, and we kind of pick a couple that we say these are going to solve our customers' problems, or the problems that we come back, our customers are coming to us with. And we always try and bring it back to that point of, I mean, we really exist to solve our customers' problems and to take the network and running the network off of their plate.
Okay.
I wouldn't say it's changed it. I would say that we see a variety of engagement models from, hey, you guys are obviously forward thinking, we'd like to work with you, and it's mutual, to you have to buy everything from us, and those are the people we don't return calls.
Okay, word to the wise. Okay, all right. How you mentioned, and I'm going to jump because we have about 14 minutes left, but I want to talk about your customers and how they're impacted by this. And Jack, I'm going to start with you. How has the way in which the industry is transforming itself impacted your customers, or has it? What are they seeing things differently, or is it your job to keep that from happening? What's your perspective?
Well, I mean, Zayo's in a bit of a transition, as you know, we're a collection, been in business for 10 years, bought 40 companies in those 10 years, very quick and agile, integrating those companies, deep, dark fiber networks in, you know, all the major markets in the U.S. and Canada and Western Europe. So, you know, our business has kind of grown as we've acquired. And if I broke our customer base into three kind of categories, the carriers, and specifically the wireless carriers, we built tons and tons and tons of network for folks here as well as others in the U.S. to help connect their macro towers as well as small cells. And that is continuing, and it's a great business. They're a great set of customers, and you know, we're excited to do that, because
So they're not at this point impacted by all this change at this point?
I think they're impacted by the change, but there's still fundamental things in infrastructure that they need to do, and to turn to companies like ours, not exclusively us, but companies like ours to help with that.
That, for you, is that going to change when they start looking to, as you mentioned earlier, support a lot smaller cells? I mean, you're building a different kind of infrastructure when you get down at that level, right?
They all need fiber. That's
Okay.
the really cool part.
Okay.
So we like that part for sure. If you then kind of switch to the web scale folks, you know, we've done a lot for the web scale folks, whether it's fiber network or data center or combination, route development, all the things that Don mentioned. So we've participated there and see, you know, continue to work with them quite a bit. Enterprise is really the place where I'd say our relationships are deepening. We haven't normally had a big enterprise business, at least until the recent last few years, where we bought Allstream, we then bought Electric Lightwave, and we had an organic enterprise business. And as that has grown, I'd say that our interaction with those customers is better. It's more meaningful than it was in the past. And their appetite for infrastructure is on the increase.
And is the way they consume that changing also?
Yeah, it's kind of funny, you know, many enterprises, I think, 10 years ago would have never even thought of operating at the lower layers of the stack, right? They maybe by an Ethernet pipe, maybe by waves, but mostly banks and others. Now I'd say every enterprise is at least there. And
It's at least buying wavelengths.
yeah, in large enterprise, buying wavelengths between data centers, between key locations in their corporation, but also more and more wanting the dark fiber between locations. And so that's been, I think, you know, we saw it in the last 10 years for sure, but I think that's on the rise.
Are you guys seeing that as well?
Yeah, I mean, for us, the most interesting customer base for us is kind of this marriage of localizing content with the, you know, internet service providers or last mile providers. And it has the, you know, both benefits simply because it's a better experience because you're taking out all the latency and all the hops and you're able to, you know, have a better over-the-top experience in the case of video, for example. And then the second thing is those last mile providers that typically were having to go to the, you know, one of the 10 major peering points to pick up the traffic.
Right.
They're now avoiding, you know, significant capital dollars on backbone augments by doing that. So that's one benefit. And then
They're not carrying the traffic as far as the content's much closer to them.
content's coming to them.
Okay.
So, and the ability to cache it is working for, and pretty much anybody that's in the content space has an edge strategy. So that's coming together pretty nicely there. And then the other one is on the larger, the hyperscale type deployments, the larger deployments, because we have the advantage of being new entrants, our design is very scalable, and with our vendors as well. You know, you talked about vendors. You know, they're coming right along for the journey with us by taking, you know, all the electrical components. And by the way, none of this is as flashy as software. It's all just kind of diesel generators and cooling units. But even then, they're putting them on sleds. They were able to pre-test them. So the unpredictability that some of the large cloud providers have in their business, you know, they appreciate that as well because we're able to, you know, control the supply chain a little bit with regard to that basic mechanical equipment, but at the same time deploy it and have it up and ready for them pretty rapidly. So these changes have been good.
Okay. All right. Anybody else? Or what?
I mean, I think I'm going to go back to the software part, but I'd say that the unsexy part is provisioning. You know, in other words, and how long does a customer have to wait, you know, to get service? If you take a look at like what's happened, we've improved that 2 to 3x with some of the automation we've done. And so I think that, you know, they're seeing that clearly as a benefit. I think in the security area, you know, some of the work that we're doing on kind of a network-based firewall that sees the whole network and then understands threats as they happen around the whole network and then pushes that down to everyone so you don't even have to necessarily be part of something that occurs that, you know, you can get the benefit of kind of from the overall network view. I think that's a big one. And then the last one is like the Flexware stuff that you had alluded to earlier, which is really about, you know, how do we provide, you know, a single box with multiple kind of capabilities and a very easy upgrade path, not only for different functionality, you know, but also for bandwidth and other things that people can do on their own. So that whole kind of provisioning, you know, security, you know, ownership model, I think has been some pretty good and big fundamental changes for our customers.
Okay, and they're getting those benefits. Tim, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, we're exclusively serve the enterprise market, so it's a little different answer. But what our customers are really excited about is seeing the benefits. You know, kind of the Flexware, the single box, especially because most of our customers have at least 1 or 2 global locations. Many are across the entire globe. So, I mean, I think we're in 120 countries. We have locations. So if you're putting a router in Turkmenistan and you know, all of a sudden decide that it needs to have a firewall too, it's pretty nice to go into the portal and hit a button and have it installed versus, you know, shipping your IT guy over there to install a new box.
Is that what, did you literally have to send IT guys to Turkmenistan?
No.
Okay. Just checking.
Mongolia. yeah.
Mongolia. Okay.
But
Oh,
not
well, it's just
Turkmenistan.
Mongolia. Okay, interesting. So obviously the customers are benefiting from that. And Chris, Tim happened to be on a panel we did yesterday on on-demand services. So we talked a lot about Flexware
Okay,
and
good.
also what Masergy is delivering. Interesting stuff. Okay, I'm going to ask something I didn't prepare you for. So if you want to duck it, you can. But it's come up in a couple of panels I've been in, and that is that recently the cost of RAM has taken a spike, and then some people are saying that might actually affect what they can cost effectively do on-prem. Are those kind of technology, those kind of realities also in this new transformed world, do they impact your business? Something like a sudden spike in the cost of RAM?
I'll take that. I mean, listen, no matter how we had done this, whether we had done it on custom equipment or whether we had done it on COTS equipment or whether we'd done it virtually, it would have had memory. Right? The memory just didn't go away or got added to because we decided to virtualize it. So that's kind of more of a general electronics,
Okay.
kind of issue, right? Like, cost of cake if sugar goes up or something like that, right?
Right.
So that's a general kind of issue that doesn't affect any kind of strategy for
Okay.
sure in the
Okay.
direction we're moving.
Would you guys agree with that?
I'm not sure. It sort of depends where in the infrastructure you look, right? The cost of memory going up will ultimately make us think harder and harder about how much of a forwarding table we have in a router. It will push us to make those sorts of trade-offs. Just because if you can shrink that down, you don't need to have as big a fib, you don't need as much memory. And so things like IPv6 could start to push us as we migrate more and more to that. That will make us consider, well, how much is memory, and how much of the fib do I need, and how can I aggregate in a way to
reduce
limit that?
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
There's like a
absolutely.
general cost benefit associated with that,
Absolutely.
right? Regardless of the current price of memory, there's a general cost benefit associated with that, right? If you have a bunch of routes you're not using, it's always better to get rid of those. If you
Yep.
really need to move to IPv6 because you have to have reachability, you're probably going to do that, and it probably outweighs it. But I would say that the general increase there, I don't think fundamentally changes the strategy, but it could change some operational things like you're describing.
Well, actually, the strategy I heard mentioned that might be impacted was what you chose to put on-prem. That in some cases the cost of the box goes up enough that we'll spend. I think if somebody mentioned we'll spend $800 on an iPhone, but if the cost of the on-prem box gets above $500, people are going, so that might be one of the impacts. But it's a minor thing. So we have about 4 minutes left. There are 4 of you, so I'm going to give each of you a minute. I'm going to do my fairy tale question, which is if you had a magic wand and could wave it and change one thing about any aspect of this transformation process, just snap your fingers and it happens. So I'm gonna give you like 20 seconds, no, 10 seconds to think about that. All right, Tim.
I would say just because it's a consistent pain point, the licensing model, and again,
The one I wouldn't let you talk about. Yeah.
to be fair, it's not even really the licensing model
Okay.
as much as it is the enforcement model.
Okay.
Because
Like managing all those licenses, or
yeah, and just the concept of phoning home. I mean, I think we learned in software a long time ago, DRM was not necessarily a good thing. I think we seem to be in a cycle of learning the same lessons over and over again, and DRM is not a good thing. I don't think companies like Masergy or AT&T are trying to pirate software. So I think that's an area that I would, if I could wave a magic wand and make that go away, it would go away.
okay, that's a good one. All right, Chris.
I mean, I think for us, because of our scale, and some of the other folks said that it wasn't as big a deal for them, but for us, it is a big deal that regardless of whether we have like 1 router, 5 routers, we have firewalls, we have a whole bunch of things that we have to put together. I would like to really manage those and orchestrate those and full life cycle those, quite frankly, in a very common way. And so I think that whole idea of like those kernel commands associated with the VNFs, if I could snap my fingers and have something happen, that would probably be it.
Okay,
Oh, I'd
have you-
take that if you did it.
I got to talk to you about the licensing right after we get backstage. We have some options there for you.
Okay, we're starting lots of conversations. Okay, Jack, what about you?
Gosh, the snap my finger parts. Our industry we always like to talk about the headwinds and all that. There are incredible tailwinds right now in our industry. Demand is awesome. The movement towards 5G small cell, I think, will continue that. I think everything that's happening in the consumer
You're just
space
determined
is-
to be an optimist today, Jack.
I know.
Going to ask for more tailwind.
It's the new job. So I really, if I had to snap my fingers, I'd say, let's keep it going, and if anything, let's see it increase some.
All right. Okay, Don.
Easy, rainbows and unicorns. It's, move faster. Be able to get into that true new world order. Get rid of the legacy stuff that holds it back. Because I do think the legacy infrastructure masks some of that opportunity for growth.
Okay.
And I think it'll deliver on the promise, and people, the market will be able to see that.
All right, terrific. Thanks, guys. We actually finished almost a minute early, so I want to thank you for that. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking our panelists. Good job.
Thanks, Carol.
Thanks,
Good
Carol.
job. Good job. Good job.